Hey everybody, welcome to a global immersion webinar. We're gonna wait just a couple minutes to let more people enter the space, and then we'll dive right in. Glad to have you. Okay, let's get moving. There's gonna be a lot for us to cover together, and we want to leverage every single minute of it. Welcome to Seeing and Lamenting Whiteness with artist and activist Andre Henry. We're really excited that you're here and are a part of this conversation. I want to start by saying that today's conversation is in honor and memory of Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot and killed by white vigilantes on February 23rd, 2020, while jogging. It's also in honor and memory of 26-year-old aspiring nurse Breonna Taylor, who was shot and killed by Louisville police officers in her own home on March 13th, 2020, as well as the countless Black lives that have been prematurely extinguished by whiteness. We hold space for them in this moment, even as we talk about what it reveals to us about us. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. It's both essential and too late. We have a problem to fix, and we need to fix it now. And I think we all have a role to play in that. And so that's why we're facilitating this conversation. I want to familiarize you to one another and offer the opportunity for us to begin to connect with each other. And so I'm certain that many of us have been on multiple Zoom calls and or webinars over the last number of weeks. But if you would click into the chat feature and put your name and where you're calling in from, that would be really great for Andre and I just to get a peek into where you all around the country and maybe the world are calling in from. And then the second feature that we want you to be really familiar with is the Q&A feature. And we both anticipate that there was some kind of burning question that you carry with you into this conversation. And so if you would go ahead and populate the Q&A feature with that question right now, that'd be really great. Of course, we're going to do our best to tend to some of those things. But I also want to say in the Q&A space, we want to give you freedom not to ask the question the right way. Let's just practice curiosity. Let's just practice asking the questions so that we can get to the things that really matter the most. So go ahead and do those two things there. In the comment section, please feel free to reach out and interact with one another. If something really pops in this conversation, feel free to capture that quote for others to see it and for it to be reinforced. Have conversations with one another in that space, but then reserve the questions to the Q&A so that Andre and I don't have to surf through all of the comments to get to what y'all are really wondering about. So it's cool to see so much chatter pop into life even right now. My name is Jer Swigard. I'm the co-founding director of the Global Immersion Project. We're a peacemaking training organization, and we form people of faith to engage our dividing world in restorative ways. That means that we cultivate everyday peacemakers who know what it means to join God and one another in remaking our world. From our point of view, everyday peacemakers engage in 4 core practices. Number 1, we see the humanity, dignity of an image of God in ourselves and in one another. We see the pain and the plight in the world, and we see our contributions to it. Number 2, we immerse into conflict and injustice with the tools to heal rather than to win. Number 3, we contend by not getting even, but by getting creative in love. And we believe that as we engage in those types of practices, restoration springs to life. The broken things start to get fixed in our world. Why do we do what we do? Because we believe that restoration is the mission of God, and that makes peacemaking not an add-on to our faith, but the very essence of it. And so our webinars like these provide access to unique and essential perspectives on contemporary moments. That means that we're in commentary with a moment in time alongside somebody who's in the trenches leading the way in practice and in thought leadership, who can then help us become substantively different kinds of people. That means that for us, a webinar like this is not just about education and awareness, it's about transformation. And so that said, let me offer a couple of framing thoughts on this particular moment in this particular conversation. Obviously, we're going to have a conversation about race and the violence of racism, whiteness, and white supremacy. In order to become everyday peacemakers, we need to learn to see, lament, repent of, and disarm these realities that are at work in our own lives and are at work all around us. This is a conversation that will push us, and it will push us on purpose. Andre and I were just chatting about how we've been soft-tailing this conversation for too long in this country. And we need to have an honest analysis, and we need to point to the realities of this. And so it's gonna push us. Now, Andre and I are both acutely aware of our capacity to even move a step beyond our existing worldview. So we're gonna do our best to hold in tension the prophetic push with the gentle invitation. And so our invitation of you is that you would be, you'd be gentle with us and generous with us, with yourself and with one another, especially in the comment section. It's likely that you'll feel triggered at some point in today's conversation. For me, being triggered is an everyday reality. For me, it feels like a surge of emotion or defensiveness, or I get a tight chest, or I get sweaty palms, or I suddenly really need to say a thing, or I feel an overwhelming desire to disengage. Being triggered is natural. And so what we want to invite you to do when you get triggered are these 5 things. 1, acknowledge that I'm triggered. It's really important just to simply acknowledge. It begins to disarm it. Number 2, ask myself why. Why am I triggered in this moment? That will lead us to number 3, identify the tone or the words or the topic that triggered me. Number 4, ask a clarifying question. If you feel yourself triggered, identify what triggered you and then ask a question in the Q&A. We may not get to it, but it will begin to create in you the practice of curiosity rather than defensiveness. And then listen longer than feels comfortable and allow yourself to be changed by what you've heard. This practice of identifying our triggers will help us move beyond defensiveness and shame and into self-empowerment and social responsibility. The last thing that I want to say is, in the reality of the pandemic and a world where we're all on technology, the chances are that this conversation could get hacked. And we want to let you know that in the event that happens, we will immediately send out a new link to you. It will show up in your inbox. We just invite you to go there, click that link, and enter right back into the conversation. But you too can help by creating and guarding a safe space in this conversation by the way that you handle yourself in the comment section. And so we want you to be showing up and engaging with one another. Curiosity is priceless and accusation is unacceptable. And so I've got a moderator on my team who's going to be paying attention to all of that. She may ask you to tone it down if you get a bit too accusatory. And if we see that repeat, then we're going to take the liberty to conclude your access to this conversation. Safety in conversations like these matters a ton. And so we get to practice that with one another. Okay, that's enough for orientation. Man, I'm so excited about the conversation that we're about to have. I anticipate that I'm going to be a different kind of person in lieu of the next 60 minutes. And so I hope that's true for you too. But recognizing that this is a hot moment and a hot conversation, we're just going to take a moment to center ourselves. So I want to invite my teammate Haley Mitsui Davis in just to lead us through a process of centering, and then we'll move into time with Andre.
Thanks, Jer. Yes, hi, my name is Haley, also on staff with Global Immersion. And in preparation for this incredibly important and sacred conversation, we want to honor that by bringing our full selves into this moment. So I'm going to lead us in a very short contemplative practice, and it starts with putting your hands out in front of you. And if you want to close your eyes, I'll guide us through this as well. But put your hands out, palms down. And what this helps us embody is the releasing of all the things that may be chattering through our mind, releasing our to-dos, releasing our anxieties, releasing any expectations. And just take a few breaths here as you feel your mind, body, and spirit all coming into this place at the same time. And when you're ready, when you feel that you have embodied this presence of release, you can turn your hands upward, and only when you're ready. And what that symbolizes is your readiness to receive. Your readiness to receive what the Spirit wants to show and do in you through these next 60 minutes, through these 2 men. And we know that the Spirit can move at any time the Spirit wants, but when we are focused on attuning to that presence, the spirit can speak so much more loudly and dramatically. So take a few more breaths here in this posture of receiving. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Haley. So again, for those of you who have just joined us, feel free to put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat feature. It's fun to see where in the world you are. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Andre. And Andre, man, so grateful for you, for your voice, for your work, for our friendship, and for the way in which you're weaving perspective that's really essential right now. And so I want to just invite you to kind of identify and locate yourself in this moment, and maybe share a little bit about how you got to where you got, and then we're going to talk about the moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, I'm honored to be invited, and I'm honored that so many people showed up. So good to spend this afternoon. Is it afternoon everywhere now? It's afternoon in most places in North America right now. So I'm so honored to spend this time with you all. So thanks for coming. My name is Andre. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm an artist and a writer that dealing with racial justice. And I ended up in this work. Well, I stumbled into it just like everybody else, you know. I don't think that most, I don't think there's any kid that you ask, you know, in second grade, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they say, you know what, I want to fight white supremacy. Hopefully, most kids don't have that kind of language to use. And but just growing up Black in America, um, I knew of my own experience. You know, growing up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, with the strong legacy of the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan presence there. Living in New York under Michael Bloomberg's stop and frisk policies and all of that, that my experience in the world is different from that of my white counterparts. And I always wanted for that to be different. But for a long time, I was convinced that there wasn't much freedom fighting to do. But when it became clear to me that America is not the post-racial society that we want to be, then that presented itself as an opportunity in some ways for me. The opportunity to no longer just feel helpless at the news of deaths like Ahmaud Arbery's, but the possibility that perhaps there's something that we could do about it. And that provoked me to begin investing my life into the question of how does systemic racism work, and what can ordinary people do to organize and confront it.
So I love that you were provoked into the work, and I'm imagining that so many of us on the call who find ourselves in the trenches in some ways have likewise been provoked. Something happened that made us say, like, I cannot not engage in this anymore. If there was a moment for you that you look back and identify, what was that moment for you?
For sure. Like the watershed moment for me was the death of Philando Castile in the summer of 2016, where he was driving with his girlfriend and their daughter. He was pulled over by Officer Herminio Yanez, who claimed that he fit the description of a robbery suspect. So, so interesting how that is always like, or now how often that is the story. So the officer claimed that Philando Castile's wide nose fit the description of a robbery suspect, pulled them over. Mr. Castile said that he had a licensed firearm in the car, and he was reaching for his wallet as he was instructed to, and that officer shot him 4 times in the chest in front of his girlfriend and in front of their 4-year-old daughter. This was just 24 hours since the death of Alton Sterling went viral, the day before. he was a Baton Rouge black man selling CDs outside of this corner store. The cops showed up. They roughed him up and they shot him. And even the store owner was saying that that it was uncalled for. These men were not under self-defense. So I could go back, and talk about, I was watching Trayvon Martin or the Trayvon Martin case. I was in New York when Eric Garner was choked to death. I was there when Michael Brown was shot in the streets of Ferguson. In the year before Philando's death, I saw Freddie Gray's death. Walter Scott was shot, Corinne Gaines, Sandra Bland, the Charleston Nine. I could go on and on. But with Philando Castile's death, I just said enough for myself. And a part of that was I saw so many of my white evangelical friends and loved ones scratching their heads asking, well, how is race involved in this? What does race have to do with this? And to be honest, I just got tired of that question, because it seemed as though people were having trouble recognizing a pattern. So I said, well, I can help people identify that pattern, because I've lived and seen these things in my own personal life and the life of my family and friends, and in history and in school books and all this other kind of stuff. So that was that moment. I made a decision that day that I would no longer, first off, I would no longer let the news cycle determine when I talk about racism. Secondly, I would invest my time into studying how does the system of racism work? And third, that I would somehow invest my body into the struggle for racial justice.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you're spot on with regard to the analysis that like a Philando Castile moment was a wake-up call in many regards to a white evangelical America. Like
For sure.
it was like this something that has always been uncovered or at the surface popped through a bit more, right? And it gave white evangelicals an opportunity to be like, that thing, there's like a constellation. I can now point to a constellation of these things, and I can't quite connect the dots of them. And I don't understand how they're connected to a much more insidious system, but it seems like there's a constellation here that is off. Right. And so the learning curve for white evangelicals has been very, very slow. Now, on the one hand, I'm really frustrated by that. On the other hand, I watch the learning curve continue to accelerate a touch. And so I'm thinking that the people who are on this call, for the most part, are folk who have been on a learning journey. They see the constellations, they understand how they're connected, and they're beginning to actually recognize the roots of these things. And so before we dive in, because I think what just happened with Ahmaud Arbery is so revealing of a historical system. It gives us an opportunity to really sink our teeth into it right now. We have to. And so before we go there, though, help us define some terms from your point of view. I know that there's 250 plus people, 260 people currently in this listening in on this conversation, and a few thousand more will probably be listening in by tonight. And so when you're talking about race, whiteness, race, racism, and whiteness, let's all make sure that we're talking about, I want to be using your definition when we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to understand this historically, right? Like there's a story about race that has a beginning. We usually don't think about that, where many of us are brought up in the world, and I was too, as though race had always been a way that people thought about themselves, and in some ways like a biological fact. But race is not a biological fact. Race wasn't like an official category in a way that people began to think about themselves until around the Enlightenment period, when people started talking about humanity in a different way. And the way that Europeans in the Enlightenment started talking about humanity was in the sense of a hierarchy, that there are some humans that are better than others. And these stories were utilized to justify the violence of the transatlantic slave trade and of the age of conquest. So like I hear people talk about how racism comes from hate, and I love how the scholar Dr. Ibram Kendi in his book Stand from the Beginning, he makes the point that race and racism don't come from hate, but that they come from self-interest primarily. That these European folks, they wanted the land in North America and they took it through violence. And the story that they told about that was, well, these people are not human like we are. So these race categories begin to emerge around that time, with Europeans talking about, it was color coded, basically, right? That white, able bodied Christian men are, did I mention? Yeah, white, straight, able bodied Christian men. Mm-hmm. They are at the top of this human hierarchy. And then the darker you get, the less human you are until you get to black, which is the non-human. So I talk about race as a technology instead of a biological fact, because it's something that was created for a purpose by human beings and utilized by human beings. And I guess that's a good segue into racism, right? Mm-hmm. Racism is the system that is based on the social political category of race, right? Racism is the Jim Crow laws of the South, you know, that followed slavery. It is the slave trade itself, with the ships and the papal bulls that were written to justify the conquest of the so-called New World. Like, racism is the expression of that anti-Black violence, right? It's about power, basically, is what I'm saying. Racism is that system, and are those structures that allow those people who put themselves at the top of the human hierarchy to express that hierarchy in policy, in their social decisions, in their behaviors. And just one more point on that. And this is so important, because when we talk about racism, people think that we're just talking about individual acts of hate or emotional, like your emotional disposition toward other people. And there are great words for that kind of stuff, like prejudice and bigotry and all the kind of stuff. Those things count, they're bad, but they're not all racism. Racism is that event in 1964 where these two white student nonviolent coordinating committee activists, along with one Black activist, go out to investigate a church bombing. They are arrested by the police, and the police release those young men to the Ku Klux Klan that night. They let them out in the night so that the Ku Klux Klan can get them. That's racism, because it's not just hatred for Black people, it's the ability to lynch with impunity. It's the ability to know that if you were to kill one of your neighbors, that you're going to sit down in front of a group of your peers and they will not convict you and they will not indict you. It's the system backing it up. Yeah. So that is all. So I think that it's important for people to understand that when we talk about racism as a kind of system of power or a relationship of power, that we understand that whiteness is actually essential to this idea. Because oftentimes when we talk about racism, we automatically go to talking about, why do Black people suffer so much? Instead of thinking about the consequences of some people truly buying into the ideology of white supremacy. And it's easiest for those who are categorized as white to buy into the ideology of white supremacy. Non-white people do as well, but it's easier for those who would benefit most from it. So around that time that Europeans are talking about how some humans are better than others, like I said, they color code this and they make it, they kind of appropriate a climate theory that already existed before that said that darker skinned people were dumber, less beautiful, all that. And so they kind of they they bake that into the system.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I think that the idea of anti-blackness is super important, because when you have that system that says white is the human, black is the non-human, then naturally everyone in between, and even those who are in the black category, are going to do what? They're going to aspire to whiteness, because whiteness is placed as though it's the ideal form of humanity. And so the way that people can constitute themselves as white is through violence against the non-human. The way to prove that you are human is to constantly be expressing to other people that they are not human. You know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the idea of whiteness is predicated upon. Now I want to be very careful, because when I say that, I'm making a distinction between people who have a low melanin count in their skin and talking about the idea of whiteness as a race category from the Enlightenment. This is why you have people in the Jim Crow era who are willing to hunt down their black neighbors, because there's, as many Afro-pessimist scholars or some have pointed out, that whiteness expresses itself through that violence. It constitutes that violence. It's the violence against the non-human, against the black body, that gives whiteness its shape, right? Now, just one more point on that is that whiteness, remember, race is not a biological fact. So whiteness is not a biological fact. So remember, the Irish, when they first came to America, were not considered white. Italians, when they first came to America, were not considered white. I was just speaking to a friend who lives in Romania the other day, and she was telling me, she sent me a picture of her sister, and I was like, "Oh, I see the resemblance." She was like, we don't look alike at all. She's white." And I'm like, "Wait a minute." You're white, you know? But contextually, in Romania, she's considered a gypsy. She's not considered white. So I want to just throw that out there too, as I'm talking about whiteness, that this can be very triggering for people who their entire lives have been called white and identified themselves as white people. That there's a difference between being identified as white and truly believing all of the stuff that comes with whiteness as it was invented through the Enlightenment. But the vestiges of those ideas are still with us. The ideas about black people being non-human, being super strong, overly sexual, not as intelligent, not as beautiful, prone to criminality, violent, aggressive, all of those ideas are still with us. And those ideas are essential to whiteness. They're a tandem deal. So when we talk about being anti-racist, we're talking about having our eyes peeled for the ways that these anti-black ideas manifest themselves and control people's behavior. We're not colorblind, because we understand that there are consequences for believing anti-black ideas. And the only way that we can identify those is if we see color. I love how one speaker, I can't remember her name right now, but she talks about it being color brave instead of color blind, right? To be an anti-racist means that we are actually a bit vigilant about identifying the way that these anti-black ideas inform our thoughts, our speech, our behaviors, our attitudes, our decisions, so that we can do differently.
That's right. That's right. And my sense is the reason that you all are on this call right now is because you see something that happened in the Ahmaud Arbery moment, and And you wouldn't be here had you missed it. You saw something. And so this conversation is about how do we see this more clearly such that we can actually engage in the work of anti-racism. And so let me just repeat back to you. I'm taking copious notes as you're talking, as usual. Andre, I hear you saying that race is an unnatural classification of the hierarchy of humanity designed by white power to accumulate their interests.
Yes.
I hear you saying racism is weaponizing race in order to systemically oppress non-white people.
Exactly.
I'm hearing you say whiteness is the racial norm. It's the ideal. It's the standard upon which everyone is measured and deemed unusual or foreign or exotic or other. I'm hearing you say that with whiteness, ethnicity is optional and privilege is automatic.
Yes, exactly.
And then with anti-racism, it's not color blind, it's color brave. We live with eyes peeled for the manifestations of racism. But we don't just point it out. You talked earlier about I'm using my body. We don't just point it out, we get in the way of it.
Right, exactly. We plan to intervene, we stage interventions, whether individually or collectively. Like to be anti-racist means to be actively against racism. Mm-hmm. Because what most people are doing right now is they're taking the worst example of racism and saying, well, I'm not a racist because I'm not that, Mm-hmm. So white people in the South, where I grew up, say, I'm not a racist. I'm not a part of the Klan. I've never lynched a black person in my life. And then Northern white people say, well, I'm not racist. I'm not from the South.
Right.
And then European white people say, I'm not racist. I'm not American.
Right.
But so this is all people trying to be non-racist.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what I try to encourage people to do is to first off accept you were born in a world where racism was already a thing and race was already a thing. You were born into a world that was built on anti-black ideas. It's like being born after the invention of the iPhone. Like, it's here, like you just have to accept that that's a part of your world. And because you live in an anti-black society or a world that's been built on anti-black ideas, it's likely that you've ingested some of those. And it's also likely that you might have even repeated some of them. You might have even acted out of them, I know so many well-meaning white people who, they're like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Mm-hmm. But the moment that their white daughter brought a black man home as their boyfriend, now that hits closer to home for them somehow. Now they have to confront some ideas and some feelings that they didn't even realize that they were holding. Now, as an anti-racist, we lean into that moment. We say, wait, why do I feel that way? And we want to examine that. We want to track it down so that we can do differently.
Yeah. So let's turn a corner then. And I'm noticing in the Q&A feature, there are some really, really good questions surfacing right now about, like, what do we do about this? We're going to get to that at the end of the hour. So hold tight there. Keep asking the questions, but I just want to acknowledge that I'm seeing those. Again, if you have questions, locate the questions in the Q&A space, because right now there are 266 chats in the chat section. So if you want us to get to your question, hit it in the Q&A space. That'd be helpful. Let's now turn, in light of those definitions and the work of anti-racism, let's turn our attention now to this moment. And so, like, your article actually went out, your Medium article went out to everybody who's on the webinar right now.
Oh, nice.
And I'm thinking that many of us have read it. It's the article called "Are All White Americans Police Officers?" You spoke to this moment being being rooted in the lethal notion that white people hold some inherent authority over Black people. Yeah. So I'm listening to the definitions that you just offered and this historical analysis from Enlightenment forward, and I'm reading that comment, and it is clear to me that there is a deep historical connection to the moment that we just found ourselves in, and that Absolutely. We do find ourselves in as. So flesh it out a bit more real. Talk to us about what you saw as the Ahmaud Arbery execution came to light.
Yeah, I just see often, just in general, I constantly find myself asking, well, who authorized you to make that decision, right? Or to intervene? Because I find that oftentimes, um, well, let's go to the story, right? Arbery is going for a run. All of a sudden, he hears these he hears someone telling him to stop, ordering him to stop because they want to talk with him. And he did what I would have done. I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop for someone. I mean, first off, I lived in New York City for 7 years. When strangers talk to me on the street, I keep moving. I don't respond
Yeah.
to strangers, you know? And I think that he did what any normal human being, citizen would do. When someone who's not wearing a uniform or a badge orders you to stop, why, right? Next thing you know, the video shows that one of the men is approaching him with a rifle or a shotgun, and he is understandably trying to fight the man off. Now, they went through 4 district attorneys about this case, because I think the first district attorney said that this happened due to Ahmaud's aggressive nature, and they they framed the actions of the McMichaels as self-defense, you know? So anyway, we have to ask the question, why do these men think they have the right to stop him? I mean, they claim that he fit the description of a robbery suspect, but even so, what authorizes them to stop him? Because if I thought I saw a robbery suspect outside, I would call the police, understanding that I do not have the authority to make that kind of stop. And that question of why they believe they have the authority, I think, applies in many different types of contexts. Because I notice in my own life, and I notice from observing the lives of my Black friends and family and my colleagues who do this work, that oftentimes it seems as though white people do presume authority over Black people. This is connected to the white women who, I think it's mostly been white women who we've seen in the news who call, the police on Black people, as they're trying to visit a loved one in their apartment, or as they're renting an Airbnb, or for sitting down in a Starbucks without ordering anything while they're waiting on their friends to arrive, or for throwing a picnic in the park, or for selling water bottles on the sidewalk or something like that. What these men did was they took the violence into their own hands. They went out with their own guns and hunted this man down. But what these other white women have done in these stories is they have called people who have guns on them to respond to the situation. Thus, also, when we understand that Black people are 5 times more likely to be brutalized by the police, that they're literally creating the occasion for which that brutality can happen. That impulse, or that reaction, is not so different from the very way that police departments developed in this country to begin with. When many police departments have their roots in the slave patrols, which were established to keep indigenous people off of white people's private property and to return escaped Africans to their enslavers. So there is something inherent in the idea of policing that Black people don't belong in white space, that they are trespassers. Mm-hmm. It's Frank B. Wilderson III, who he and there's a whole movement of people who call themselves Afro-pessimists. I'm not an Afro-pessimist, but I do find some of their analysis to be compelling. And one of the key tenets of their intellectual movement is that the idea of Blackness and slaveness are linked permanently. And so Black people find themselves being looked upon and treated as though they were still slaves hundreds of years after enslavement was supposed to have died in this country. And we saw that dynamic between the Macmillans and Ahmaud Arbery, that he was treated as though he were a fugitive slave. He was treated as though he had run off of somebody's plantation. And they were asking, where are your papers? Which is the same thing that these women have been doing basically when they say, do you belong here? Where do you live? Who are you going to see? Do you have a permit? Where are your papers? Same thing happens to me happened to me when I first moved into this apartment complex where I am the only Black renter, where I've been asked, where are you going? Who are you coming to see? Where are your papers? So I say that the notion is lethal because we see like this extreme case where these men took the law into their own hands and killed this man themselves. But I think that you have to trace this all the way down to its most seemingly benign or minuscule manifestation in order to get to the root of it. And I'm moving on. I think I'm already kind of moved on to some of your other questions, but like what this reveals about the history of whiteness in our country, I think is, what we were talking about.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I just want to point out in the comment section or in the chat section, Jonathan Cap, he says, how do we recognize the assumption of authority over Black people in ourselves? Like you're hitting, Andre, like on this, and this is where I want to dovetail into like a James Baldwin, I'm not your Negro. In him saying I'm not your Negro, he's saying not only am I not your Negro, what does it say about you, white man, that you need a Negro in order to feel human? You need to dominate. You need to express power over. You need to subjugate. You need to destroy. What does that say about you that you have to do that? Not just because you don't like people of color. It's because that's the way you feel alive.
There's an internalized superiority complex that many white people have that it seems to go undetected a lot of the time, And so what you just said, like, why do you need the Negro? I always think about this. Like, think about the Montgomery bus boycott. These Black people were being mistreated by these white people in Montgomery on the transportation system. And so they decide, we're not gonna ride the bus anymore, right? And that triggers a violent backlash. Wait a minute. You were treating these people like they don't belong and as you don't want them around. But then when they say that they're not gonna come around, you're upset. You want to be separate, right? Yeah. And they're saying, fine, we'll separate. Right. But you want for them to show up to play their part in the oppression game.
That's right.
You need for them to show up so that you can be violent to them. Because otherwise, what will it mean to be white if you're not able to do that?
Whoa.
Right?
Yeah.
What will it mean? So that is the conundrum of that is the thing. Like, I'm not saying that white people are evil, but I'm saying that there is a history that we've been trained in, that we have been rehearsed in very well, to where we start operating out of these ideas automatically. There's one scholar, I'm so sorry everybody, I keep saying one scholar and I'm not remembering anyone's names today, but he says that racism is really made in order to control the behavior of white people. Because
flesh that out.
Because what compels two men to run out into the street and chase this man down and hunt him like an animal? It's the promise inherent of being white that you can be a master, And so, like, they're chasing that privilege down the street, Now, most white people are not gonna do that, right? Like, I feel like I can say that confidently. I don't think that most white Americans are like, they see a Black guy run down the street and they're like, bring the shotgun, right?
Right.
However, I think that, and this is where I was going, like, bringing that down to its smallest kernel, right? Is, for instance, I think it was last fall, or maybe it was earlier this year. All I remember is that one day this seminary president wakes up and tweets that James Cone is a heretic, the founder of Black liberation theology. James Cone was a heretic, and he would be surprised if he met him in heaven, right? And I'm like, what makes you wake up in the morning and tweet that?
Right.
Why? What is the purpose? And that is an attempt at overseeing, black people's thoughts about God.
Mm-hmm.
You are saying, you know, you are saying that you get to set the boundaries of what is orthodox, and you get to say how black people should think and talk about God. And if they don't, you'd be surprised if they're in heaven. So wait, now you're making that decision too? Like Jesus is consulting you about who's going to get into heaven? And I see that kind of nitpicking online a lot, where black people say something that is true about our experience in America, and a white person jumps in and says, "Not all white people." You should say some white people when you say that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, if you want people to listen to you, then you're gonna have to change your tone, you know? Oh, well, we want civilized conversation, and no one ever won anybody over by being disruptive. Oh, Dr. King wouldn't do it that way,
Yeah.
you know? Like, all of this is
Yeah.
policing.
Yes.
When really and truly, to quote Frederick Douglass, white people could just mind their own business.
Yeah, man. Yeah. This is where, sorry, I thought you were taking a dramatic pause to let that
No, I mean,
sink in.
I could keep going, but I was like, let's just sit on that for a second.
No, totally. That's what I'm saying.
Because that is what has happened in all of these situations, right?
Yeah.
The young lady who was taking a nap in the commons area of Yale when a white woman called the police on her, that white woman could have minded her business. The folks who were having that cookout in Oakland, the white woman who called the police on them could have minded her business.
Mm-hmm.
Tatiana Jefferson was sitting in her home playing video games with her loved ones, and the white woman who called the police on her could have just minded her business.
Mm-hmm.
So the person who asks, how can we recognize this? Sometimes, well, first off, I think that a lot of black people, and I think that a lot of people of color are growing into our own voices to tell white people, hey, back off. Now, that doesn't feel good, I'm sure, to experience that. But that might be a sign right there. Hey, I need to listen to this for a second and interrogate what just happened. But the other thing that I think is, when white people feel this impulse to interject, to oversee, to coach, to educate, like without solicitation, to really like sometimes sit back and be like, okay, well, is my opinion really necessary here? Is it warranted? Did anybody ask me?
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's where, like, I just feel like your article in particular was so meaningful for me, because it's this, the policing, the controlling of Black lives, like the audacity of whiteness to say, I have the right, maybe even the responsibility to do that. Yep. Do you know, like, so the illustration that you just gave about the seminary president, before this conversation, I maybe would have moved in the space of like, why is there so much hate in that man's heart? In light of this conversation, it makes me go, why did he wake up so insecure? He woke up so insecure that he needed to throw a digital punch to feel like he had power, not even to feel like he had power, but to maybe feel like he was alive again. You know, it's a sickness that I'm also recognizing, the tight chestness, like, this is ingrained into my being. You know, this is not something that other people are tweeting. This is stuff that if I don't tweet, I want to say sometimes. You know? But like this idea, and this is where like there's been a lot of pushback. Candace Owens obviously came online, I think yesterday, just outraged about the use of the term lynching. I've used the term lynching. I've watched you use the term lynching in describing what this is. Talk to us about this as a contemporary lynching and why that actually is an appropriate term. And then I want to talk in a moment. I want to dovetail off what you just said about, are we safe anywhere? This is the message. So.
Yeah, I mean, a lynching, simplified, is an extrajudicial killing, right? There was no trial. There was no jury, there was no evidence. These people just took it upon themselves to kill him. And that by definition is a lynching. Mm-hmm. I just recommend people just like, Candace Owen is just not a credible source on these things, So, I know that she's trying to spin it some other way, but it just is what it is. Like that's by definition a lynching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it. But I'm also saying like the lynching is an act of violence, as is controlling the movement and questioning the motives of Black lives, as is
Yes.
condemning the presence or the motives or the activity of Black people. That is an act of violence,
Yes.
as is silence and
Yes.
indifference an act of violence that I have the privilege to enact. You
Yeah.
know, and so like I think this is kind of what Dr. King's talking about when he's writing the letter to the white Christians, is he's saying, right, the violence is not just held in those who hold the ropes of the lynching.
Right.
It's also
Exactly.
in your indifference and the fact that we're having a conversation right now that is way too late.
Yes. I mean, in America's mind, imagine America's collective imagination, Black people are dangerous. You know, that was constructed in the early 1900s, you know, after slavery, you know, to legitimate the Black codes and Jim Crow and pig law and convict leasing and all the other stuff that came after slavery, right? And so Black people are policed as though we are inherently dangerous. But the truth is that the fact that people think these things about Black people makes them dangerous. That makes them dangerous for us. And so white people need to police one another the way that white people usually police Black people.
Mm.
White people need to police themselves, their own thoughts, their own attitudes, so that they can be weeding out. Because just like you said, like, and like I've tried to say, like the fruit of this tree is blood, right? It is the hanging, the shooting, the choking, the beating to death of Black bodies. But the seed of it is way more subtle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it does begin with white people checking each other sometimes. I mean, and just asking each other, saying like, well, why did you feel like you needed to interject into that conversation?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
why did you
And
feel like you needed to do that?
let me ask you that, because I also feel like there's a paralyzing fear on behalf of white folk too. Like I feel like I feel compelled to say something, but I don't want to say it wrong.
Yeah.
You know, so like that's another. Can you speak to that a bit, because there is some value in being a white person who says a thing, whether you say it perfectly or not.
Yeah. I mean, you got to make mistakes. You know, that's how you get good at anything. You're going to make some mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And that's the only way. The only way to get better at this is to allow yourself to make mistakes and just keep the same humility of like, listen, like you're gonna try to do some stuff. Sometimes you're gonna do some stuff. You're gonna put your foot in your mouth. Okay, take it out. You know, like,
Mm-hmm.
accept that criticism. Accept that feedback. You know, and keep studying because your motivations have to be in the right place to do this. Right, like it cannot be about winning applause from Black people. Like you're going to be a problematic ally that way.
Mm-hmm.
But if this is about you wanting to to be faithful to God by loving your neighbor in a practical way, then it won't matter if somebody calls you out for doing it wrong because you're actually interested in that information. You know, if this is about being on the right side of history, if this is about, you know, if you're doing this, if you're getting your motivations in the right place,
Mm-hmm.
then hearing that, hey, appreciate what you're trying to do, but not that way, is actually a gift to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So here's a question that just popped in the Q&A is like, what does it communicate to you when white folk don't speak up?
Oh yeah. Well, this might be kind of depressing. I stopped counting on white people to speak up years ago
Okay.
because the truth of the matter is that many of them just wouldn't. I spent so much time trying to persuade my white loved ones that racism was really a problem, that it was a fixable problem, and that we could do something about it. And the more that I did that was the more that I realized that a lot of the white people that I knew just weren't interested, you know?
Mm.
So it tells me usually that people are silent because at the end of the day, they either don't want things to change or they don't believe that they can.
Hmm.
But I think that a lot of people who say that they want things to change actually don't. Because the truth of the matter is that all white people benefit from this racist system.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that we're asking people to do is to truly follow Jesus, who, although he had equality with God, did not consider it something to cling to, but emptied himself of his rights and became as a slave. Yeah, we're asking white people to actually like really take on that kenotic part of the gospel. And that's the narrow gate.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you this, because I agree with you, and I want you to get hyper practical in a second. I've been camping in this whole moment when Jesus says the last will be first and the first will be last. And I'm recognizing the hardest thing about making the last first is that the first have to get out of their seat.
Yep.
That's the hardest work. It's easy to get people to the front of the room. It's impossible to get, in this case, white patriarchy out of the seat, you know? And so how do we take this connect journey from your point of view? Like, would you give us some coaching from your perspective on what are some of the things that white folk need to do? I mean, you say in the end of the article, there's some work. White folk, there's work to be done here, and you got to take the responsibility to do it. And so, from your point of view, what are you inviting us to do?
I think that white people have to come to grips with the fact that if they truly want a racially just society, then white people are going to have to organize a mass movement to free themselves from all forms of white supremacy.
Hmm.
They can no longer say, I'm not a racist because I'm not a Klansman. I'm not a racist because I'm not a Southerner. I'm not a racist because I'm not an American. No, all white people have to, not all, but at least 3.5% of y'all white Americans have to get together and organize. Now, what do you need to organize? There's so many different ways to organize things. Well, Jonathan Smucker talks about fighting. He talks about this as a hegemonic contest, a contest for power. And he splits this up into two halves that are interconnected. You cannot separate them, but in the abstract, we can talk about them individually. One part is the symbolic contest. The symbolic contest has to do with our common sense, meaning making, how we think about ourselves and about the world, what we believe. It has to do with culture. We have to tell different stories about ourselves. I said ourselves. White people have to tell different stories about themselves, where they're not always the hero, where they learn things and glean things from Black and brown people, right? You have to organize the telling of those stories, whether it's by starting a book club or a monthly potluck where you read Black and brown authors and educate yourselves on history. It has to be through the educational system. It has to be through creating media. Some of you are artists. You need to be making songs and plays and movies that counteract these anti-Black ideas and that counteract these internalized superiorities. Some white people are going to have to take it upon themselves to see a therapist who can deal with that internalized superiority complex. Start some white people support groups so that you can say, yes, my name is Jer, and I too am a recovering white supremacist.
That's right.
You know? And everyone can say, hello, Jer, and you can all talk about it. You know, but you're gonna have to organize. I'm just joking around with Jerry. He just happens to be the white person who's
I can absorb that, and I resemble
that. So there's the cultural, there's the symbolic contest. Another way to win victories in the symbolic contest is to stage disruptive symbolic actions. This is what the civil rights activists did during the civil rights movement, when they staged the freedom rides, when they staged the lunch counter sit-ins. They were dramatizing the problem. and polarizing the country. And I know how white people hate being polarizing, but you're gonna have to be a little. Some of y'all gonna have to be a little bit polarizing and disruptive, because the polarization actually draws a line in the sand and makes people make a decision. Choose ye this day whom you will serve. Are you going to follow Jesus into the world of peace and justice and unity that God has always imagined? Or are you going to choose white power? And that is the decision that people have to make. And many made it in 2016, but they're going to have to make it again in 2020. Anyway, that's another way, staging symbolic disruptive action. So there's a whole spectrum on the symbolic side. The second part of that hegemonic contest is the institutional contest. This is where we're talking about changing laws, changing policy, so one thing, for example, is that the bar for proving discrimination is so high that it's almost impossible to ever raise a case that will be heard by the Supreme Court to say there was racial discrimination in this instance. That needs to change. And the way that we change that is by, you guessed it, organizing. We know that the mass incarceration system, for instance, is the successor of the plantation system, the chattel slavery system. So how do we get in the way of that? We organize. We know that the most powerful person in the mass incarceration business is the district attorney. Guess who elects the district attorney? You do. So we need to organize and get people to elect different district attorneys who will choose to not slap black and brown people with a stigma that basically renders them a second-class citizen, just like it did in the 1950s. The answer broadly is white people have to organize themselves for racial justice if they're serious about it, amongst themselves, to free themselves from white supremacy. The other part of that is joining black and brown led groups that are organizing for racial progress. Join as a support, answer some phones, knock on some doors, collect some email addresses, play a supportive role in those initiatives and groups that are already doing that work, that are led by black and brown people. And you enter there not as a coach.
Come on.
Don't come in there and try to sit on the front row and be like, okay, now I'm here. All your problems are solved. I'm here. I have some training at this white school, so we know how much better it is than you guys' schools. That's still racism. The thing that you want to do when you enter that space is you want to be an agent. You want to be an agent that confronts whiteness in that space. So when there are white people who are expressing that kind of anti-black ideas that are undermining authority, that are being paternalistic or whatever, you want to go to them with your gentleness and your graciousness and your ability to hold this stuff with a little bit more emotional distance and try to coach that person into how they can be a better support. Again, I know I've said it, but I'm just going to keep coming back because I talk a lot and you might get lost. Organize, 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 organize.
Yeah. And I just want to, on that last point that you just said, pre-organize, organize, organize, is I think as white allies in a room following the lead of leaders and influencers of color, part of what we have to do is we have to learn what it means to absorb the violence of other white people in the space.
Yes.
Like get in the way of the white folk who are getting hot and bothered about the tone or the word or the critique or the narrative. Like I think once we begin to recognize the reality of whiteness in our own selves, we'll start to despise it. We'll interrogate it more deeply. And for me, as a white male, the spaces that Andre is talking about right now, that's where the schooling happens. Because what I notice, Andre, is you're not once saying, here's the top 10 books I think you need to read. While you are saying, yeah, do your homework, because we have to do our homework.
Yes.
But I think whiteness has given me permission to remain in my living room reading the latest James Cone book, and while good, my transformation happens in spaces that are being led by people of color.
Yes.
That's where I learn about whiteness. Yeah. And not only in the way that I hear them talking about it, but like I feel it surfacing in me and I go, oh, that's what that is.
Yep.
And so finding ourselves and then sitting in the back of the room, listening and not leading anything. We've got nothing to offer but our presence. And that seems super critical right now. There are so many unbelievable questions.
I was just looking through there. We got
Yes,
So many.
there's so many. There's so many. Let me say this. I want for folk who need to jump off, let me say just a couple of things. Andre, I don't know how hard pressed you are for time, but if you want to stay on just a little bit longer, and while I'm doing some closing remarks, you can look at the Q&A and see if some of those really pop for you.
Yeah.
Let me conclude for those of you who need to jump off. If you, many of you follow Andre, the Andre Henry is the handle. I want to encourage you to listen in on Hope and Hard Pills podcast. That's one of the as consistent as he's popping them out, I'm taking them in, and I encourage you to do the same. You can go to and then you can go to his website. This link will show up here in the comment section, and all of these things will come out in a post, a follow-up email to all of you. All of these links will. But I want to encourage you to go to his website and subscribe for his email distribution that he sends out consistently. Keep getting this perspective inside of you. It's how we begin to vet out the whiteness. It tills up this stuff in us, and it's really important. So subscribe there. I also want to point to his Patreon page, and like one of the greatest opportunities, those of us who have the privilege of resources, is to support people like Andre as he continues to use his voice to shepherd us forward. And so unleash some generosity toward this man as he continues to do this work at high cost to himself, not only financially, but emotionally, socially, mentally, and spiritually as well. So I want to just encourage you along those lines. Next steps with Global Immersion. Our team is available to support you on this journey. Our team is made up of sojourners on this pilgrimage to vet out the whiteness and enter into the restorative revolution as collaborators. And so in the follow-up email, you're going to see a link. If this is helpful for you, to register for a one-to-one with one of our Global Immersion teammates who is already on the way towards seeing and disarming and decentering and dismantling whiteness. And so we're hoping to utilize these one-to-ones just to accompany you as you navigate hard conversations like these, as you navigate the leadership challenges that emerge, that as you navigate questions like, how do I build, how does this conversation become contagious with white folk who are super defensive about these types of topics? Or if you're wondering about, like, how do I stay centered and grounded in the midst of all of the chaos? Our one-to-ones are really designed just to accompany you, listen to you, and do some troubleshooting with you. So take advantage of that. That link will come out in the follow-up email. I also want to invite you into some daily contemplative gatherings that are hosted by Haley, who was on at the beginning of the call. There's a link that will pop up that will get you access to those. And then the best way just to be in touch with us is to text the word peace to the number 66866. And that will link you in with us and the resources, including the webinar archive that features people like Andre with other conversations that we've been having. And so I'll close with a quote from my friend Randy Woodley once Andre interacts with a couple of these questions. But I want to say to you who are listening in, thank you for prioritizing this moment. Thank you for taking the necessary steps to see whiteness more clearly. And I'm imagining that you've listened to something that has moved you, and the big question is going to be, what are you going to do about it? That's where the rubber meets the road in terms of our transformation and impact beyond the conversation. So thank you. Those of you who need to jump off. We'll stay on for just a few more minutes so Andre can interact with some of these questions.
Yeah, I want to comment on a couple of these. I see Marie Moy said, can we be careful not to make this a binary conversation? And I hear a lot of Asian folks and Latinx folks who say this about the black-white binary. You've got to listen closely when I talk about this, because what I talked about was a hierarchy. And what I mentioned was, with white at the top and black at the bottom, that the people in between aspire toward whiteness. Even black people do aspire toward whiteness as well. So it's not binary. The thing that I'm counting, and this is hard for some people of color to hear, is that anti-blackness is a global operation, and people of color have often been white people's junior partners in anti-blackness. And so the binary that I cut, and that many other scholars do, not all do, but the binary that I cut is between black and non-black. Because all people, even black people, can participate in anti-blackness, which answers another question that someone asked here, which was another one I wanted to comment on, was that someone asked, can black people also have anti-Black ideas. Yes, Candace Owen is a great example of a Black person who espouses anti-Black ideas, and it's not a new phenomenon. There were African people, uh, Leo Africanus is one name, who was writing about African people like in the 1600s and writing things basically that were feeding into the African savage trope. So anyone can do that. So I am including Latinx people and Asian people, and even my neighborhood is mostly Asian. So the suspicion that I was met with was not from white people, but from non-Black people. I saw a lot of questions about what to do. I think the first thing that the first step anyone should do is always take responsibility for your own education. Educate yourself. But I also want to add on to that, like the thing that I kept saying about organize, is we need to be thinking about interventions. It is not enough. And I use this analogy a lot, but like if you saw someone who was getting mugged, there is you yelling after the robber, "I disagree with you," is not going to do anything. That we need an intervention. There are so many great questions in here, and I just don't feel like I can do them justice. And I have like a 3-minute out. But let me just take this one, I guess. Andre, can you share with people who are not Black what it means to some or all African to remain silent? Oh, we already responded to that one, didn't I?
Yeah.
Are there resources and next steps to take things to my white majority local church? Oh my gosh, so many. Like, I don't know who you follow online, but I think Austin Channing Brown is a really good person. But she's very direct. See, this is the thing. If you have to tiptoe around white people's feelings, I'm not sure where to point you into immediately. Because if people are really sensitive and are going to push back a lot, I mean, what about White Awake? What about
Yeah. I was going to say Daniel Hill's book is really important in that regard. I know David Swanson just put out a book called Discipling the White Church.
Yeah.
I would also point, though, to Reverend Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil and all of her literature. She's coming out with a new one as well, which the title escapes me at the moment. But her new book, she and I were just talking about it, is going to be incredible.
Yeah.
So follow her, pick up her book. I'd also want to point to Oshita Moore in the Twin Cities. Her recent book was Shalom Sisters, and she, as a Black woman, has a very distinct call to white peacemakers. So I would follow Oshita as well. I think that would be really helpful. Lisa Sharon Harper has been really helpful and is kicking out some good resources too.
Also, Latasha Morrison, and I see a lot of people also putting her in the chat too. I don't know why Latasha's name didn't come to mind first. She's a friend and she does a group on Facebook called Be the Bridge, and they're also really great. So those, I mean,
look at the resources.
Really great
I mean, Jamar Tisby.
So you might want to screenshot.
I know.
Before you leave.
We'll do our best to actually capture the comment thread, because I'm thinking Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. I'm thinking Willie Jennings, The Christian Imagination. I mean, James Cohen, the Cross and the Lynching Tree. All of these things are incredible resources right now for us to be reading. So, Andre, I want to say thank you to you. This has been incredible. The gift that you've given us, not only in your perspective and your story, but in your coaching, in your challenge. It's a mistake for us to leave this place inspired, and you've done so much more than that. I think you've given us the ability to sink our teeth into the transformational journey ahead. And so I want to say thank you, because I know that you're careful about the spaces that you navigate, and rightly so. And so that this would be one of them means the world to us and to so many who are on it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thanks everybody for spending this time with us.
Let me close just with this. Indigenous theologian Randy Woodley writes that the barometer of whether we love God is the flourishing or not of the most vulnerable among us. He's saying that it's not enough not to be physically violent. And it's not enough to simply say something on social media. Putting the last verse means that the first have to give up their seat. We have to learn to actively support the well-being of one another, especially those who are targeted, consumed, and dominated by whiteness. Malcolm Foley quotes Francis Grimke saying, "Race prejudice can't be talked down, It must be lived down. This is what, Andre, I hear you saying: organize, organize, organize. And Black people have been trying to live it down ever since it reared its infernal head.
Yeah.
It's about time, this is the Grimke quote, it's about time that the universal church, and I would say the white church, joined us in that endeavor. Lives have been, are, and will be at stake. And so, friends, go with that, go with the blessing, go with the charge. Let's continue to become substantively different kinds of people. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Global Immersion webinar. Thanks so much.
See y'all.